The third chapter of the Westminster Confession is entitled Of God's Eternal Decree. And this chapter expresses the idea that some men and angels are, as it calls it, predestinated to eternal life, and some foreordained to eternal death. And this doctrine of predestination was one of a number of reasons why Montgomery and other non-subscribers could not agree to sign the Westminster Confession. To Montgomery, the doctrine of predestination was absolute anathema. This is a doctrine that we can trace back to the early church, and in particular to the writings of St. Augustine of Hippo, who lived at the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century. But it was something that Montgomery utterly rejected. And he rejected it for a number of reasons. First of all, he considered that it did not reflect God's justice. He felt that it constrained God to act in an unjust way if everything was foreordained. And he actually argued very much against what he called gloomy Calvinism. And he didn't like what he saw as the strict and restricted nature of Calvinism. He wanted to emphasise the free grace that was readily available through a loving and forgiving Father, rather than a strict and judgmental God. And in fact, he used this idea ironically because he emphasised that Calvinism looked to God's justice and emphasised God's justice, whereas in the doctrine of predestination, as far as Montgomery was concerned, God was perforce presented as unjust. So that was one reason why Montgomery rejected this doctrine. Another was, of course, to do with his emphasis on the right to freedom of judgment, to free will, and to the associated responsibilities. And so Montgomery found it outrageous that we should not be considered responsible for our own actions. He considered this to be very important. And so if we are to be responsible for our own actions, we cannot behave simply in a preordained, pre-patterned way. We have freedom of choice, we have freedom of will, and that also for Montgomery went against the doctrine of predestination. And in this he emphasised greatly the Epistle of James. Some people still believe this to have been written by James, the brother of Jesus. And of course, James lays great emphasis on deeds, on the fact that faith is empty if it is not backed up by deeds, if we do not live out our faith. And this is something that we hear emphasised very much in the contemporary theology of Moneyreagh. Reverend Chris Wilson regularly refers to this idea, and I've also discussed it with our wonderful church secretary, Miss Gwen Kinnear, and she puts it very succinctly, deeds, not creeds. So this idea of Montgomery is still resonant in contemporary and modern non-subscribing theology. John Scott Porter considered that rejection of the doctrine of predestination was an absolutely essential characteristic of Unitarianism, and that, I think, is absolutely true. And this encourages us to reflect on what Montgomery meant when he talked about Unitarianism and what his attitude was to the Trinity and perhaps to that doctrine. So we'll think about that next time.